Welcome to the Christ and Classics podcast, where we consider the classics in light of the Christ. My name's Colton Moore, and I'm here with Devin Wilkins, and we've got a special guest today. His name is Dr. Mark Menaldo, and he's an associate professor and the head of the Department of Liberal Studies at Texas A&M University-Commerce in Commerce, Texas, to which he came in 2017 after spending 7 years at Texas A&M International University. He attended Colorado College as an undergraduate student, and it was here that Dr. Menaldo discovered the art of close reading and the power of interdisciplinary scholarship. He took these skills with him to Michigan State University, where he earned his doctorate in political science. As a teacher now, he encourages students to see the connection of ideas across disciplines and beyond the classroom. When he's not teaching, he can usually be found drinking coffee at the local coffee shop, reading a book, or talking to friends. He and his wife are the proud parents of 3 children, Oliver, Henry, and Ava, and they reside in Greenville, Texas. Dr. Menaldo, can I call you Mark on this? I mean,
please do.
Is that appropriate, Mark? Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Mark or Air Menaldo, if you want to go German on me. So.
Well, Mark, we wanted to have you on this podcast because you and I are just recent friends. We've only known each other for a year and I guess 3/4, going on 2 years now. We went to church with each other for a short period of time where we briefly got to know one another, and over the last several months, I mean, most of our relationship has been consisted in phone calls and texting and various meetings here and there. But I'm really excited to have you on and to share how just give us your experience with the great books and how they've shaped you into the man that you are today.
So I suppose we are.
Yeah.
So first of all, thanks for that introduction. It was brilliant. I don't know who wrote it.
But, well, don't copy and paste it into Google because you might find that introduction on some other college website.
My webpage.
Did you write that?
I suppose. Yeah, I did. It was my student friendly. I was supposed to write a student-friendly bio. So that's my student-friendly bio.
It was a great bio. That's why I picked it.
I think bio should be a little more impersonal, more personal.
Colton, does Mark teach at your alma mater, or did you go somewhere else?
Oh, good. Yeah. So, yeah, I got my undergraduate degree in music education at Texas A&M University-Commerce. And so Mark teaches there as well. Yeah.
Oh, but he wasn't your teacher.
No, I don't think you came in 2017.
No,
I left in 2015.
He left out.
Oh,
I suppose. I suppose what I'll do is, I'll contextualize the answer, by giving you a sort of a description of my education. And this sort of the odd way I came to, the greatest book of all, so to speak, right? My journey has been one in books, but the Bible was not one of them for a very long time in my life, up until early 40s, I would suspect. But like all numbskull high schoolers, I had no idea what I was going to do going to college. Not all people are numbskulls, but I definitely was part of the numbskull pack. I was a sort of introverted kid. I didn't like reading for class. I liked reading on my own. I thought I was cool because I was reading Herman Hesse rather than reading the standard English class books. And I suppose like every kind of wayward youth, I was looking for some sort of cheap transcendence through books like Siddhartha and looking for meaning in places that you just weren't finding it. I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up with this sort of strange Latin American spirituality in my household and in the culture around me. which could be a whole other podcast. But when I got to college, uh, I discovered. Well, I didn't discover it was imposed on me. I was like I was put in a philosophy class against my wishes, and
Hmm.
I had this sort of.
This is at Colorado.
Actually, this was my first institution. Was Fairfield University in Connecticut. It was my freshman year. I spent my freshman year in Fairfield. It was a Jesuit school, and the only reasoning behind that was my mom says the Jesuits. My mom's from Long Island. She's like the Jesuits got money. So she thought I'd get a scholarship, and I did. I did get a scholarship, and that was the sort of the my mother's calculation was where you grew up in Mexico, you're not going to get in-state tuition. We got to get you guys scholarships. So at Fairfield, I was confronted by a Jesuit, so a man in the collar, and I was just like, "What the heck's this guy doing in the classroom?" And we're reading these books. Probably my first couple weeks in the course, I'm just in a fog. I don't know about you guys freshman year. It's like, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
I was always tired. Nobody's doing,
insecure.
no one's doing my laundry. The food stinks. And out of nowhere, right? So we go through the first weeks of class, reading actually a book by Thomas Nagel, The Problems of Philosophy. And I'm like, what is this? This is boring. Not into it. Why am I in this philosophy class? And then we read our first dialogue. I didn't even know who Socrates was, to be honest. I read our first dialogue, which was the Euphythro. I don't know if you've taught that, but the Euphythro is a dialogue on, so to speak, on piety, where Socrates he runs into Euphythro, who is Socrates on his way to his trial, and Euphythro is going to be, what is it? He's suing his son? Or is it he's suing his father? I can't remember, for killing a slave. And the basic gist of the argument. I talked to the gods, and the gods told me to do this, and it's against nature, so to speak. He's going against his own blood. But the reason I was compelled to want to read it is because this dude reminds me of my dad, which is, you think it's not just my dad who thinks he speaks to the gods. And like, it's still, in this one-to-one relationship, it's like, oh yeah, God told me to do this, so this is what I'm going to do. And you're like, oh man, this guy's wacky. So in the first sense, it was very, very personal, because the Euphythro very much was an immediate relationship to my life, like the context where I grew up. But secondarily, it was Socrates interrogating Euphythro. And, it's hard to recreate these memories, right? Because you're still a dopey 18-year-old. But if I had to sort in a nutshell, I would say, hot dang, like, who talks like this? That was my, who is this guy? Who's this guy interrogating this? And why are these questions, why is like this unrelenting questioning, right? Boom, boom. It was like Mike Tyson with words. And I never had experienced anything like that in any conversation with any human being, right?
Was the Euphythro an assigned text?
Yeah, it was assigned. So we'd read Euphythro, then we read the Apology, then we read the Republic, and then we kind of began the Ethics, I remember. But the point is that this something happened. I got stung, I was electrocuted, you name it. And I just remember being this one fool in the class who was reading every page of the text, right? And I still have my freshman notebook. I write down the page number, and I try to rewrite the dialogue so I wouldn't be lost. And all I know is that something happened, and I didn't want to stop. That was the sort of career choice I made in that moment. It's like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know, but I want to read these books. But the issue is that then I transferred from a very, if you know anything about Jesuit schools, they're not quite like St. John's, but their core curriculum is very strict, right? You're going to study religion, you're going to study philosophy, you're going to study music history, you're going to study art history. Like, they still have a very, well, I don't know if it's changed, but they had a very strict core curriculum. I transferred to Colorado College, which is in a whole other world in terms of college curriculums. It's a one class at a time. Was very little in terms of structured curriculum. It was very free. It was very open. And I majored in philosophy there. But the philosophy there is very interesting because at Colorado College in the late 50s or early 60s, I don't remember the decade, a philosopher named John Glenn Gray worked there. And he was one of the first English translators of Heidegger. And before the world, before America knew Heidegger, Colorado College was very Heideggerian. So by the time I'm at Colorado College, that department is very what we call continental philosophy. It's all about continental philosophy. It's very Heideggerian and it's very postmodern. So my education in the classics in undergrad was almost nil. I didn't read ancient authors. I read Heidegger. I read the moderns. I read Hume, Kant, Paul Pierce, British philosopher, empiricism. But I probably read Heidegger in 60% of my courses.
Wow.
And at the end of my education in undergrad, and reading Heidegger and Lacan and Foucault and Derrida and all these sort of postmodernists who were they were still alive and all the rage. I finished feeling I felt an emotion of sort of incompleteness, right? And inarticulate at the same time. I was both inarticulate and incomplete, and went to Michigan State. One, because I wanted to keep studying Heidegger, but two, because I understood that the curriculum in political philosophy that I was going to read was much broader. I was going to read ancient. All I knew is I was going to read ancient authors, and I got to Michigan State really not knowing what I was getting into, and I got these strange ducks, these faculty members who they would schedule their classes on Thursday night once a week, and we would sit down. We'd come in and we'd go from 7 to midnight. We're like, I'm like, it's 10 o'clock, man. The class is over. But all the all the older students knew we're going to meet about 5 to 6 hours each week. And we're just going to read one book. So we would read one book a semester. I didn't know what I was getting into, but it turns out that my faculty, they were of the so-called school of thought of Leo Strauss, which was a German Jewish emigre who moved to the U.S. and made, was a somewhat opaque yet controversial character in the U.S., especially his students. But their mode of teaching was very text-driven, transliteration, and we don't contextualize the thinkers. They contextualize us, so to speak. They speak beyond their times so that's the basic gist. And so in grad school, I read Aristotle and Plato, but I also read Montesquieu, I read Franklin, I read Rousseau, I read Heidegger, I did Nietzsche, and it was divided in, if you wanted, in the most simplistic mode between the ancients and the moderns. And Leo Strauss thought that there was a massive difference between ancient rationality and modern rationality. So that's the setup. That's the setup in terms of where I come from. If I was the great book education or the canon of Western political philosophy, it goes from pre-Socratics all the way to Heidegger.
Yeah, it sounds like you were really curious, and that kept you going. But was there a discomfort along the way? What led you to the point that you would become a believer?
Okay, so so I'm done. I finished grad school about 29.
Yeah,
I think, and so I taught from age 30. So we'll put D-Day as May 1st, 2022, because I wrote it down. That's when I finally took part in the Lord's Supper.
Wait.
So that's the timeline, May 1st, 2022. Yeah.
I was there. C3 Commerce Community Church, a small little.
Nice. I know. Oh, that's right. You were there.
Small little community. I remember because one of the pastors stood up and was just like in tears, just so thankful that you were partaking of the Lord's Supper for the first time.
Yeah,
It was a
Ron.
fantastic moment.
Yeah. So what happened? I mean, again, this is a sort of reconstruction of things, of a nonlinear process. For me, it was always nonlinear, which was um, it's hard to simplify. I would say as you age, there's a couple things you realize. One, I'm not a philosopher, right? Like in some sense, I didn't see myself living the life of a philosopher. And think of the the ideal of a philosopher is Socrates. Right? He's got a wife and kids, but they're never around. Right? He's got a job, but he never does it. And I'm far less complicated of an individual. I'm a very simple guy who likes ice cream and movies and my kids. But so I understood that like my life was not quite to be pursuit of philosophy. But on the other hand, I think I understood philosophy enough to feel in a fundamental way intuit that it does not offer a consolation in this life. Right. Or not even the afterlife, in this life, like and I liken it to like I feel like Socrates was someone who, if he felt an emotion, he would immediately cauterize it by thinking about it. Right? So philosophy is like it's cauterizing anything that would make you anything that might cut you at the knees. You should be able to deflect. And I'm just not that kind of human being. And at the same time, you from a thinker's perspective, it kind of tends to nihilism. I think like it's easy. I don't always see as say ancient philosophy as only as a contemplation of the good. You read enough of it and you understand they're very skeptical too.
Yeah.
Right. Their intention with their skepticism. Right. Their idealism and their skepticism. It's not like they were confused about idealism and they didn't understand that there was a nihilistic streak in human nature. They were far more careful about veiling that than, say, Nietzsche and Machiavelli were. So I would say that I had some very negative consequences from studying philosophy for 20 years, which is that I would, to use the language of Christianity, it had hardened my heart to a very significant degree. But I could also intuit that I don't know how to explain it. I wanted out. Does that make sense? But I didn't know how.
It's like you were living the allegory of the cave or something.
Yeah. Where it's like I'm in the cave and I see the philosophers going out who maybe get to glimpse the sun, and I'm stuck in the cave. I'm like, well, where are they going? And they're like, you know what, Menaldo, you don't get the car. We'll tell you about it when we come back down, but the sun's too bright for you. And I would speak, you know, and then if you're a human being with personal relationships, it's very hard to accept the indifference of the cosmos, right? So you have children, for example. You have children, Colton. I don't know about you, Devin. I remember very clear experience when my son was in the ER, and we didn't know what was wrong with him. We just knew that he, through a series of what seemed unintended a happy coincidence, he ended up getting a CAT scan when we just thought he had a throat problem. And he had to have what turned out to be a minor operation, but if not attended to, it could, for children of that age, you can have deadly consequences. And all I could remember is the rage I felt at not having any control over that situation. Right? Sort of I'll use the heady term, like cosmic indifference. Right? I can't do anything. Nothing, you know, what is a father to do in a situation where he has no control? That's where I like my whatever stoicism I might have just went out the window.
Yeah.
Right. And so I knew that the thing that oriented me towards God wasn't anything philosophical. It had to do with the relationship between my children.
Mm.
And I felt that the Socratic mode had nothing to offer,
Mm.
right? Because the Socratic mode, in some sense, tells you your children. This is what Socrates tells you about children. He says it's a nature's lottery, right? Your kids are it's like puppies in a pen, and it's very likely that your kids aren't going to be philosophers. So Socrates dotes on Plato, and his kids are nowhere to be seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have that instinct. I had the instincts in which my strained relationship with my own father, and my desire not to cultivate a strange relationship with my children overrode my need to see the sun, right? To leave the cave and see the sun. And it wasn't until I went through a summer read in Genesis. There's a great book, if you're interested. It's called The Beginning of Wisdom by Leon Cass. It's an 800-page explication of Genesis.
Wow.
And it wasn't until a section I read on Noah about how his sons, in some sense, symbolize both the reverence and parricide, right? Ham symbolizes a denuding of his father. But I realized I'm both of those people.
Mm.
I'm someone who lives in conflict with my own father. It's like I'd never in my life read philosophy and come to a better understanding of my father until I read that explication of the relationship of Noah and his sons. And when the moment that happened, I felt like there was a movement in my soul, right? Like a turn. There's the notion of Socratic turn.
Yeah.
That you turn towards the philosopher's soul turns outward for the first time. Then in this sense, it was like a restoring of a heart problem, right? I had a little heart surge. I didn't have the big one, but I had enough to like have some blood pump. And the beginning of restoring a relationship with my father, even though it was just in myself, my dad didn't understand this. I couldn't have a conversation with him at this level. I just knew that something had changed. Something was different. But that was still a very philosophical reflection of scripture. It wasn't it wasn't the notion of a personal relationship with Jesus. And, for me, Jesus was in a different camp altogether. I didn't know how to approach him. I didn't know where to start. I kind of sealed him off. I was like, okay, I'll stick to the Old Testament in some sense, and I'll seal off the New Testament and let it, this is in your mind. You've got a plan, right? I've got a plan for Jesus. He doesn't. This is the philosopher's mode of thinking. I have a plan. I'm going to control it, and let me structure my understanding in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I had this. I conceived. I'll just go through the Old Testament book by book and see what happens.
Hmm.
Well, that didn't quite work. That didn't quite work the way I expected it.
What got you interested in reading Genesis? I'm
kind of random in my reading. Like I'll just pick up a book and decide that this is the thing I'm going to start reading. I started reading I started reading Samuel 1 and 2 because I was interested in the sort of epic journey of David.
Yeah.
I had read some line somewhere that David is the closest thing to having Aristotelian friendship in all the Old Testament. So I started reading that, and then I was also reading Cormac McCarthy's Road at the same time. And I think, Colton, if you might recall, I said the Road was the sort of, before Genesis, the Road was the thing that just made this. I had created this hardened, cauterized heart, this armor, and the Road was something that just pierced the armor, right? This chink in the armor. And I remember getting to the end of the Road and feeling this overwhelming sense of being in the place of Papa in the book, the main character, who loves his son, but has also been hardened by this sort of post-apocalyptic world. And he is, in that sense, veering towards nihilism. Mm-hmm. And his son's the only thing that can save him. I don't know spoiler alert, if you haven't read The Road. That book has something very spiritual in it. That should be immediately taught in classical schools, to be on a senior year, teach The Road. But during COVID, at some point I said, why am I reading 2 Samuel? The book starts on page 1, so to speak. Let me go back and start reading, page by page.
Hmm.
And I suppose I got to I got into numbers by the time COVID happened and we went home, and I started just feeling sort of tectonic shifts happening. So I stopped at numbers, or I stopped at, I don't know, remember where I stopped. I might have read the whole Pentateuch. But then I picked up Cass's Genesis and spent the rest of the summer just reading his book. And then the next summer I read his book on Exodus. But in terms of like the classics shaping my Christianity, it was more like the possibility of a nuclear meltdown than a sort of happy congruence. It was Chernobyl was about to happen because I'd been so hardwired to put revelation in a whole different world of understanding. And philosophy and religion lived in separate spheres, right? It was revelation isn't philosophy. Philosophy is philosophy. Very, very not. I had a not Catholic view of philosophy. The Catholics see a beautiful synthesis. Aquinas synthesizes Aristotle and the scriptures, but Leo Strauss was of a different mode of thought. His worldview was centered on Maimonides, which is revelation and philosophy live in a very uneasy tension with each other. Never shall the twain meet. There was a sort of firewall separation.
I kind of wonder what would have happened if it ended up staying at the Jesuit school,
Yes.
Because
and it was very true. As a child, I was very primed towards God. In ways my brothers weren't. I was always searching for God. I don't know. That's one of the great counterfactuals, right? Like, what if he had stayed at the
in God's kindness?
I know that you collaborated in a class with Pastor David at Commerce Community Church. So was this before or after COVID, where you kind of co-taught a theology and philosophy
way
class?
Before, like 4 years.
Way before, okay.
3 or 4 years before that happened.
Really? So, like, how did that play into all this?
Oh yeah, I found him supremely interesting. I was curious, right? Because look, the thing is like I wasn't some sort of atheist, but I did have a standard sort of slogan. It's like, well, you can't demonstrably either prove or refute revelation. So that was a modality. And then when I met David, he was going through Romans, I think, in his community group, and I was just his neighbor, and I just walked in one day. I was like, this dude reads the Bible the way I read philosophy, line by line. Right? I had no expectations. I had no expectations. I had no prejudices. I'm like, all right, I just saw to at what level of specificity he was taking the text into consideration. And when he would go fast for the sake of the group, I would get upset. I'm like, why are you going so fast? Slow down like you were doing. And so I found that very curious. I found that interesting. And so when we taught our faith and reason class, I saw it even better, right? I saw a better sense of how much close reading was involved in his perspective as a Christian. But at that point, it never got higher than the level. It was like, ooh, like that was, how to describe it? It's like watching an athlete perform, right? And you're at the game and you're like, ooh, nice moves, right? Like that was a great reading. But I didn't go home and tell Carrie, let's go to church. I'll tell you that it was hard for me to get under. I was very interested in Jesus. I was like, this is a curious cat, right? This dude there's something going on here. I had a tough time with Christians because I didn't find them interesting, right? So, and these were my prejudices. I'm like, aren't you more curious than, like, why aren't you guys studious? Why aren't you, and you know, these were just also egoistic problems as well. But and so what I would presume is that Jesus was more of a philosopher than meets the eye, right? I thought he was enigmatic, esoteric. I thought the fact that he wrote spoke in parables reminded me of Socratic irony, and thus in my presumption, his teaching must be veiled. The teaching must be veiled, and thus it must be at some level fundamentally philosophic. David totally disagreed with me. He's like, no, it cannot remain veiled. I'm like, no, it has to remain veiled. You Americans want everything to make sense. I'm putting them in with the ancients, right? I threw Jesus in with the ancient understanding, ancient communication, a whole different order.
Yeah.
This is the question is like, well, what if I'd stayed at Fairfield, or have we moved on? Oh yeah, what did the class yield? The class yielded a relationship with David, a friendship, right? And
Yeah. And David is now your pastor.
yeah, now he has to put up with
he
me.
baptized you, correct?
Yes, he did. He said the funniest thing once. I said, "What?"
Awesome.
He said the funniest thing in that class. I said, "Man, if Socrates and Jesus would have met, what a conversation that would have been." And David, without hesitation, goes, "Yeah, he would have become a Christian." And I just laughed.
Oh,
I laugh
wow.
because I'm like, what hubris, right? You know, in my eyes, it's like, no, it'd be like a good, it could be like Bruce Lee versus someone else, right? It would be like two giants of some sort. But he was so sure, and I was like, how are you so sure? And I loved hanging out with David, but for him, everything was always returned to like sovereignty of God. I'm like, man, give me a break. Just let the human thing happens sometimes, right? So Socratic things are human things, and the peaks of humanity are at some level human genius. And so it was like a friendly joust between me and him for 4 years. But very polite, never at some level, we never degenerate into, but I can't imagine having to hang out with me for 4 years and being like, oh man, that guy, he just like, if he just if that would happen, yeah.
So, Mark, you're teaching at this college, and even co-teaching a class with the local Reformed Baptist pastor there. And describe for us what it was like for you to realize that Jesus' claims in the New Testament to his identity and his message in the world are true. What happened? What did God do to bring you around, if you will?
Besides a lot of pain, right? I think first pain, like pounding. Like I got pounded, man. I got pounded in emotional pain. Because, like I said, that armor was that armor. It turns out was not, what is armor made of again? It's that metal. It turned out it was aluminum foil. It's like you're done. You think that it's armor, and he tells you, no, it's aluminum foil, kid. Like you don't have anything here. It's so brittle, but the mindset is so hardened, and the heart is so hardened that it takes a long time. But so what had to happen is the strangest thing had to happen, because I had this Aristotelian, when I was undergoing what, let's call it conversion for lack of a better word, I didn't want it to happen. I could sense something was happening, and and at an intuitive level, I didn't want it to happen. That's for sure. I wasn't along for this ride at all. I was like, when you're just holding on to like metal bars and you don't want to fall and you're slipping down the steps or something. I was like, I'm holding on to these bars no matter what. and in my mind, it's like, as long as I keep, so there's a Islamic philosopher named Al-Farabi who brought, thanks to him, the Greeks survived, right? The Muslims save us because the Greek philosophy was going to be lost. And Al-Farabi had an Aristotelian view of God, of Allah, right? And which I think Muslims sort of still share, which is God is an ineffable substance out there, right? It's a sort of, upon reflection, you only can admit that it's not even a he, it's a perfection. And that perfection exists in perfect indifference to nature, which is the reflection of his creation, right? So we exist by nature, and think of us as, our human nature is teleological, has a telos, it has an end. We can understand those ends. Whether we fulfill those natures or not is really not up to God, right? So again, firewall exists. I'm like, that's good. That's my God. Mm-hmm. Al-Farabi's God, Al-Farabi's Aristotelian God is my God. I can understand God as a perfection, but not as a person who cares about me. And I remember I had to psych myself up at one point saying, that's your God. Don't forget. don't lose sight of that's your God. Really? It's like, because I didn't understand what was that. And I started going to these, I just went pure God. I just dove into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John over and over and over and over and over and over again. I can't tell you to what I can't remember how. And it just, I emotionally, a sort of hole opens up in my chest, and we get to John, right? And I'm listening to this almost like on a loop. If your audience doesn't know David Suchet's full reading of the Bible, now's the time to get into it, because he's a British actor, and just like Platonic dialogues, if you read the Gospels dramatically, it brings them to life, so to speak, right? And I just remember getting to the part, what do we call this part in John, in the upper room, during the Passover, and then after the supper,
the farewell discourse.
I would say it was the beauty of the poetic and mournful Jesus, who's trying to uplift his apostles who are moribund by the fact that they don't know what's coming, but they know something is ending. I just remember basically breaking down and crying, right? And I knew, and wondering, am I losing my mind? That was my first instinct. Am I lost it? What's going on? It's a very rational reaction, right? It's like you're listening to I read in Bonhoeffer. I'm reading the Gospels. Like I'm listening to monastic chanting. I was like, this guy's like, anybody who knew me must have thought this guy needs a psychiatrist. And I'm it's just pouring out of emotion, but emotion because it's so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. Like what he says is so beautiful that in retrospect, I'm realizing I'm finally touching reality. Right. And it's not the way you thought you were going to touch the reality. You thought you were going to touch the reality Socratically through dialectic. It's not that at all. It's through soothing. It's through comfort. And it's from Jesus, what Jesus is saying, right? Now he can give it to a Pharisee without that was my favorite. That was my early favorite Jesus. Like, oh man, this guy is killing it, right? I think he's funny. He's comedic. I wish I knew Aramaic so I could get the play on words and the puns. But it's how he comforts the disciples. I think that is the most I should know it by heart because it's a line that I think really just caught me. But does he say he'll be with them till the end?
Always to the end of the age.
At the end of Matthew.
Right. So what happens, what I think is happening in Jesus is the impossibility of man to think of both the particular and the universal, right? That's what the problem of Plato is. Plato is not an
Mm-hmm.
ideal form thinker. He's a tension thinker, right? He's always in tension. The forms are never full, formal, and complete. It's actually satire in the Republic. The forms are always in the fact that they're incomplete because you're in the particular relationship between your particular self and trying to understand the eternal things. But Socrates proves that although he's the ideal, he's still stuck in particularity, right? Read the Symposium. That is the explicit book where you
Mm-hmm.
realize that the Republic is an extreme and the Symposium is its moderating influence because you're still an erotic being tied to a particularity, right? I think Jesus is
Yep.
what happens for us because we cannot understand the universal. Jesus is the particularity that gives us access to the universal, right? To the eternal. And we would never do it on
Right.
ourselves. We cannot philosophize on our own, right? We only get to cosmic indifference. So, and he also comforts you by saying you don't need to philosophize. Um, Philosophy is good, but you don't need it. It's not an end in itself.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's like a
So you put yourself out of a job.
oh
no, no, I
well,
don't because
it's
I yeah, go ahead. I think if you read Platonic dialogue the way they're supposed to be read, you can read the Bible in a way that I don't think it's read. And so here's my big critique: I don't see people read
hmm.
the
Hmm.
Bible with life or joy. I think they are a little too accustomed to. I guess that's not the right word, but to like institutional reverence, right? The pastor said that this is how I should treat them.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I try to say, the scene of the scene in which he asks when they ask him for should we pay the tax to Caesar, right? I start
Mm-hmm.
imagining like the crowd around, everybody around, right? Like these are tense situations. These are worldly situations, human situations. He's like, hey, let me see a denarius. Like I'm just what a cool move, you know. Think of the
I
apostles, the
know.
little puppies. Like, oh,
Yeah.
what is he going to do now? And I think of him. I'm like, oh, he's looking at the denarius. You can't see this in the podcast, but he's like flipping it and looking at it and looking like cool hand Luke, right? And then he gives, and then you get the famous line, and then right, you give to Caesar unto Caesar, God is God. And then I imagine him taking the denarius and flipping it
Yeah.
back, and the Pharisee catching it, and everyone going, right? And everyone around him, like all the apostles, like burn, And I think
Oh.
that right, I think that human element is missing when we talk about it, when we study it,
Yeah.
and this is probably the same that you two gentlemen feel, being steeped in the classics. It's like it's too American. Like when I'm around
Mm-hmm.
my brothers and sisters, they're like I feel like they've Americanized themselves, or they don't understand how American they
Mm.
are, or how modern they are, or and this is not a flaw because I'm not poetic, but how unpoetically they read, right? And so the Bible is
Yeah,
poetry,
that's
it's
right.
literature, it should be also joyful, I think. Even and so it's not there's something too heady about the interpretations, I think, that forego the particulars. And that's the
Yeah.
problem of reading Plato without reading the particulars.
Mark, you are the epitome of what I would have loved to have as an undergraduate professor. And not only that, I'm really thankful to have gotten to know you. I wish I would have been in commerce for the last commerce Texas for the past 5 or 6 years to get to know you and like see the Lord work in you step by step as David and the other pastors have. It's from my outside perspective, it's an incredible encouragement, and I'm delighted and very thankful to call you my friend. We are just about out of time, unfortunately. We didn't get to our other question about reading, but you kind of touched on this like right there at the end. So praise God for that, for structuring it that way. Devin, any last questions or thoughts?
What was the question? So at least I know.
Oh,
What was
the
the
last question? Yeah, that last question was just has your approach to the ancient philosophers and ancient classics changed since you've become a Christian? And perhaps we could maybe ask that question on a different episode and like spend a whole time just talking about that and how we ought to read the pagan classics and what ditches to avoid.
Oh, I'd love to talk about. Yeah, I'd love to talk about.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. So, well, Mark, I'm not sure if you've been listening to the podcast, but we have a good buddy, and his name is Micah, and he's got a fantastic edition of Be Thou My Vision, and he takes us away every single episode.
Yeah, he does.
You know what I'm talking about?
All right.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Okay.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glosshouse can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glosshouse offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glosshouse.com today. Glosshouse, language resources for the global community.